Welcome everyone to another edition of MOYATalks. We are still on our April Sustainability and Innovation series, and we have a special guest recommended dearly and highly by Lisa, Cesar Corona. Cesar is the Assistant Director for Engagement at the USA Center for Public Diplomacy and the Executive Director of the Expo Museum. He is an expert in the intercultural dimension of innovation and its historical role as a diplomatic humanistic tool. Cesar, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us and for your time.
Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be with all of you.
Cesar, let's start. We
Yes.
usually start by asking our guests or learning a little bit about your career arc.
Okay, so I'll be brief. I always liked traveling, always liked other cultures, and I always liked music. So initially, I wanted to be a sound engineer. So with the idea of traveling around the world with bands, I studied electronics engineering and music at the same time, and it was a really hard thing to do. So I actually did very poorly in both. Uh, but then my exit, my happy place was the language school. So I just spent a lot of time learning languages. In my Portuguese school, I received a pamphlet about Expo 98 Lisbon. And I thought, well, maybe they can take me there, the Mexican pavilion. And so they pay for my trip, and I actually get to experience a country for extended period of time. It's about 6 months. So when I came back, I decided to go into international relations, and I continued working on World Expos, trying to learn new languages. I have studied many. I cannot say I speak many, but I mean I always liked the idea of learning a bit more about other languages and cultures. So briefly, I mean very briefly, that's my career.
Cesar, how did you get from the UNAM,
Mhm.
the National University of Mexico, to the United States diplomacy?
Okay, so when I was in electronics engineering and music, I always also looked for scholarships. So, I mean, my GPA was very low. I went to the scholarship area, and they basically told me there is no chance you can go anywhere. So when I started international relations, I always thought that I would go back and get a scholarship. So I did way better. I went back. I got a scholarship to McGill University in Montreal. And as I was in international relations, I always had some trouble finding a framework for how do you explain all these governments going to a foreign country, all putting pavilions together, and then trying to talk to regular people, just private citizens. So in one of my classes, one professor mentioned public diplomacy, and he explained what it was. I can tell you what the definition is. But then I came back and I started researching. And USC had the only master's program in public diplomacy. So I applied, I got there, and fortunately, the director of the program was very involved in doing research about World Expos, but I mean, as a historian. And then the Center on Public Diplomacy slowly got interested in Expos. So it was a very, very good match. It was a lot of luck to get there. Fortunately, it worked very well.
So that's how you got to become interested in expos as a form of diplomacy. Could you explain the
Exactly.
concept of public diplomacy?
Yes. So public diplomacy is the communication of sovereign entities, sovereign polities, think states or intergovernmental organizations. So through duly accredited representatives, so through diplomats, with private citizens subject to the jurisdiction of other country. Basically, a government or a diplomacy entity talking to private people from other countries. That's basically the idea. So public diplomacy within diplomacy is like a softer version because on the one hand, you have a formal voice, diplomats who are, it's a very rigid world. They are very careful with what they say, and they are talking to public in general. So on the other hand, people can say whatever they want. They can ask whatever they want. And you need to find a balance there. So that's why it's a bit different from traditional diplomacy, because it can be more informal, but still very careful.
It's interesting. So how did this develop? Let's go back in history, because I'm a historian, as Lisa is, and perhaps your teachers were. Uh, when do you start seeing this shift from the role of expos as a tool of diplomacy?
So, well, World Expos started in 1851. And the reason why the expo, the Great Exhibition in London of 1851 is considered the first expo is because there were these national exhibitions basically organized by France and the UK. Their purpose was to bring inventors, creators all together into a place, so the people in general could come and get ideas and become more innovative. And in 1851, for the first time, they invited other countries. Now, it's a bit unclear when the diplomatic part started, because at the time there were invitations to other countries, but I still cannot find evidence that invitations were sent through diplomatic means. Nowadays, since 1931, there's a convention that actually makes countries hosting an exhibition invite other countries only through diplomatic channels. And the reason for this, and again, this is a bit unclear when it happened, is because at some point, before there were these expos were regulated, countries and private organizations started to organize expo after expo after expo. Sometimes countries would be invited, but the host country wouldn't know that there was an expo because there was a private entity organizing it. And it was very confusing for everyone. And imagine countries willing to invest all this money into a pavilion and then they don't really know if it's official or not. So in 1931, they made it official. It has to be through diplomatic channels. So in the sense of governments communicating to people, I would say it started in 1851. But it officially became clear in 1930. Well, 1931 was when it started, but the first expo under that regulation was 1935 in Belgium, in Brussels. So that's when it became official. And I would say like this body of countries regulated by the convention actually officially knew that they were going to communicate with the public through their diplomats.
These pavilions where they can, right? What is your role as executive director of the Expo Museum?
Okay, so well, there's just to clarify one thing. There are two Expo museums. There's the official one, World Expo Museum, which is a solid building in Shanghai, which was created after the Expo in 2010. Our organization is an online community that started in 1998, the time when the Expo in Lisbon happened. So expomuseum.com was mostly developed by Urso Chappell. It was his personal project, and he sadly passed away about a year and a half ago. So we took the project. A group of friends and colleagues of Urso decided to keep it going. And what we are doing now that's slightly different is that it was initially a project more for fans of Expos. We want to make it also a resource for governments, for people who want to learn about Expos in a deeper, more accurate way. So we're trying to integrate research, more documentation, more. So we are covering Expos and getting photography, doing interviews, and slowly doing that. Expo Museum right now has 5 staff members. All of us do this as on the side. We have full-time jobs, so we are moving that way. But the idea is to create a hub for people who just go to expos as visitors for fun, and also to people who organize expos. If they want to hear from visitors, what's the experience, what they want to see, what they want to live, and for countries, for example, how do they justify spending all these millions of dollars on a building for culture. So that's the idea, to create a resource around Expos.
And you recently came back from the Dubai 2020 Expo, right? Which was delayed
Yes.
in time.
Yes.
The theme was sustainability. What projects or exhibits surprised you the most? What pavilion you say, wow, this is incredible?
Yes. So sustainability was probably the main thing, but there were other two that are important: mobility and opportunity. In terms of sustainability, and I think it makes a lot of sense with talking to an architecture firm about this. The Morocco pavilion was very interesting in many ways. First, recent expos have started to ask countries to basically dismantle their pavilion after the expo. The reason is because after some expos, buildings are left abandoned. Many of these buildings are not cannot work as anything else. Really, it's hard to use them as offices or housing. It's really hard. So what Morocco did is they, from the beginning, decided to have a building that's going to stay. And for that, you have to negotiate with the host. So it's going to be a building, a housing complex. But so in addition to that, they used earthen architecture. And the idea was to get all their materials from within 3-mile radius. So in addition to just getting the materials from right next to them, these the air, the soil keeps the building cool, which is very important in a place like Dubai. So I think, I mean, in terms of environmental sustainability, I think it's a very good example. But I think if I may use the idea of sustainability as a cultural legacy too, I think it's very important that a country like Morocco has a building that's beautiful, that has a message, that stays right there for people in Dubai to continue to see. So it's going to be decades. I mean, that the message is passed on to visitors. So I think Morocco was probably my number one in terms of sustainability.
What was the discussion on policies for sustainability and for the other two areas, mobility and opportunity? What will people take back from the expo?
So this happens at two different levels. Expos traditionally are for the public in general, families, students, people who aren't really experts. They go there more for entertainment and learning than actually for deep discussion. So what expos have started to do at another level is they organize conferences with experts. And this time, it's the first time I see this. I'm not sure it has happened before. Some of these discussions happened in open spaces. So we would see experts, and if anybody in the public wanted to sit down and listen to them, they would be able to do so. These discussions were also recorded to be seen online. So that's the expert talk, so to say. The other level is just the message that pavilions pass to the public. And I think in this case, probably the most, the clearest one was Germany, because they made it, first of all, they created their pavilion as, they call it Campus Germany. It's an educational journey. So you go learning, you have, I can't remember how they called it, but the idea was that there's like a sort of place where you learn, and then next to it, under the same theme, there's a place where you experiment. There were 3 sets of this. Then at the end, you have the graduation hall, which is a place where everyone comes together to think about our impact in the world. And they had these layers of depth. So if you are there for just new ideas, something quick, you can do that. If you want more information, there's more information, never too much, actually. And if you really wanted more, there were staff willing to talk with you. And they were very educated. They would tell you the pros and cons if they didn't agree with one idea. Very, very university-like. So what people take, each experience is different. You know, I can combine Germany with Japan, with Yemen, with Mexico, and other people will have a completely different experience. Also, the order in which you visit pavilions can change your impression too. You may get a framework from one country and then you see how it works in a different country. But the idea is that after these visits, because they are mostly, you know, an edutainment, if you will, and they're supposed to happen in a friendly, happy environment, people just absorb some of these ideas naturally, and it's a seed. The idea is that they start thinking about it. So those are basically two layers of communicating these deeper ideas to the public.
Interesting that what you say, because you plant the seed, but you also have this layer, and then you have the layer itself that these pavilions are representing nation states,
Yes,
sovereign states, which itself means a discussion from a certain level, but underlying that, you have people who can discuss these, experts who come from different countries who have a different discourse, not necessarily based on the interest of their nation states.
exactly. And that's actually where public diplomacy comes into play, because I mean, if you read the documents of countries developing their theme, what they want to communicate, it's usually very official. There's not a lot of room to play with ideas, and that permeates all the way down to hosting staff. They are very careful with. I mean, if you see press, just be careful with what you say, or some countries even tell their staff, send them to the press office, don't talk to them. But at the same time, these experts are a bit more free to talk. They have more authority, and they are not really linked to the government. They're invited, but they are free to talk. And in addition to that, there's always some informal interaction. I mean, if you dedicate a little bit more time to talk to hosting staff, they open and they tell you more about their impressions. So that's why I sometimes prefer or give more value to talking to hosting staff than the pavilion and the exhibit itself. But yes, there's this kind of conflict between the official and the unofficial, the natural, the authentic.
Say between even the broad topics, right? A broad topic like sustainability, we have seen it with COVID. When you treat an infectious disease like COVID from the perspective of a nation state, you can fail miserably because it doesn't stop at borders.
Yes,
So you have to be open to different kind of diplomacy.
exactly. There's, I think we have learned and we continue to learn that, yes, I mean, nation states have political borders. I mean, there are things that change. You still use a passport. I mean, but things like diseases, like nature, like climate, I mean, weather, that doesn't really stop at borders. So we're forced to interact with other countries, basically. There's no option.
Global policy.
Yes. Yes.
So a couple of questions before opening the floor.
Yes.
I would like you to briefly tell the audience what exactly the USCC CPD does, please.
Yeah. So CPD, Center on Public Diplomacy. We're a small research center in USC, but I think we have a strong impact in the sense that we research public diplomacy from many aspects. So it can be from what governments do, from what NGOs do, what the public can do, how to get your message across, but also we integrate communication frameworks. So, for example, we study propaganda techniques as to understand, just like right now, what's happening between Ukraine and Russia, how a message is transmitted and developed in the effort to create an effect. So we use all these tools, and we create resources for basically other researchers in other universities, for governments. We train diplomats. We train members of NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. And we also provide a space for discussion. So, so we try to bring experts from different parts of the world together and share their points of view. So that's in a nutshell what we do.
I'm going to share the page with the team later because I went through it while I was doing the research, and it's a really good reading. It's a really good
Thank
read.
you.
We have excellent articles there. So I'm going to open the floor now. I have more questions, but let's give the chance to the team. And if nobody has questions, then I go on, right? And Noor has one. Please, Noor, go ahead.
Hello, I really like the topic and the title that you carry. I mean, I come from three very conflicting backgrounds. I'm Iraqi born, my mom is Iranian, and I'm raised in the US right now. So all these three countries, they don't get along very well politically. At least Iraq and Iran are getting along now, but not before. Yes. So this is really interesting, like that complexity and the what you guys are doing. My question about, I mean, the World Expo. So it's very interesting to see how academics view the best pavilion versus the public. And as a designer, it's always like, for me, I struggle with like what the public likes and what me as a designer with my background likes. So how do you guys study that? And another question is, are there criteria that you guys provide the criteria for what should be in these pavilions or not, or the countries they provide these criteria? Because there's a lot of you see a lot big discrepancies between these pavilion in what they show. For instance, I know the cost of these pavilion and the donations and all of that contribute, but even in terms of the message, how can it be not like more political message, less a political message? Like who developed these criterias?
Okay, so please help me if I forget one of your questions, because I tend to do that. Okay. So really quickly, I became friends with a woman from Iraq who moved to Belgium, and now she lives in Dubai. So I like these stories of multiculturality, and I think, I also became very good friends with a guy from Syria. I don't know, when you make friendships at that level, like the top politics kind of like becomes strange. But well, let me answer your question. So for best pavilions, I always let's say I don't like these exercises that some organizations do about, oh, what's the best pavilion, the top 10, because I think, first of all, you cannot say that during the expo, because the purpose is basically to pass a message to the public. I think you will see which pavilion was successful if you're fast in a year. I mean, these are ideas that you plant, and they take time to develop, and maybe someone on the fast end would go visit your country right after they saw your pavilion. Okay, that's the fast effect. But maybe someone in 5 years meets someone from your country, and now they have a framework, a context, and they are going to interact better with you because of that. So I think the only way to know if a pavilion was good is to actually ask the public, and to compare that to the objectives of the country. I think that's the only way. In terms of design and architecture, yes, I mean, of course, as experts, you can bring your point of view. There are best practices. There are, I mean, techniques that help you determine what works or what not. I mean, what's well crafted in your industry. But so you can, of course, say these are the top 10 in architecture, the top 10 in design. But I think in the end, the main objective is the public, is what they get, what the visitors get. Now, for what to bring to countries, I'm going to tell you an example I just learned about for Dubai. So for the US pavilion, which usually doesn't do great, they took two ideas this time. And one, and actually the two were from professors at USC. One was to, well, in Expo 70 Osaka, the US brought moon rock, the original. So it was there for people to see, and it was very impressive. But the designer at that time, Jack Macy, if I'm correct, said you should let people touch the rock. I mean, that's going to be even more impressive and more memorable. So they decided to do that in Dubai. So I actually touched the rock. I mean, it's amazing. You start thinking about things. It's a black rock. I mean, you see the moon.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was going to be white, but well. So that's one thing. The other one was to bring an original object that would be meaningful both for people in the US and people in the UAE, but also in the Arab world. So they brought an original Quran who belonged to Thomas Jefferson.
Oh.
And so they had for display. Of course, you couldn't touch that. That was super protected. But the idea was to bring something to say, you know, we actually have some how to say, like, important moments in life that we connect.
Yeah.
One of our founding fathers had this volume of the Quran as an important piece of his library. So I think those are good examples when pavilions actually do research or ask experts. In many cases, they don't. And sometimes, I think this is a major flaw, sometimes pavilions think of their exhibit as a museum, like it's a one building that people are going to visit and leave, and that's it. But no, you're competing. Sometimes people want to see as many pavilions as they can because they are there for 1 or 2 days. There were about 250 pavilions in Dubai. Imagine, I mean, you have to develop something that's very memorable. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, very well. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nata's question is related to this. She asked, like, to what extent does it really have an impact, the innovations that are presented in the pavilions? Are they really implemented?
It comes in different ways. So let me go back to like 1867 in Paris. Again, I have read this from not from primary sources, so I don't know how accurate this is, but I heard that Jules Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues of Submarine. I can't remember the name in English. I know the name in Spanish, but submarine travel. That work, based on what he learned in the Expo in Paris in 1867. So it's not only using the objects, the inventions that are presented there themselves. The idea is to inspire. So when you start seeing different innovations from different countries, you start making connections. The idea is that people generate something new after that. So that's one piece. The other one is sometimes you see technologies that are basically ready to use, but still not fully implemented. So like the what we use now on phones, the touch screen. I believe that was presented in Knoxville in 1982. So if I'm not correct, it's around that time. Excuse me. So imagine when you go there, you see that, and you start thinking, how can we use this invention, this technology? I myself have been impressed by some ideas. For example, in 2012, Germany brought what they call the seed board. And just let me tell you how it was explained to me. It was an iPad made of cardboard that actually worked. And I was like, wait, I mean, it sounds super amazing. So I had to see it. I mean, there's like a trick, but so it's a piece of cardboard with some identifiers on it that you can barely see. And then when you put it on there next to an exhibit, a projector on top detects the identifiers that determines what's your language, and the device knows where you are. So you can hold it, and then you can pass pages like this, or you can move them like this. It's all the sensor and the projection interacting with your seatboard. And then you can keep the seatboard. You know, you bring it home, it's a nice souvenir. So that brought me into new media fully. I mean, I started studying how I can do that. I started studying Python. I'm still very new, but it just gets you thinking about what you can do yourself. So these are basically the approaches to technology. And really quickly, not all pavilions show innovations or inventions. I think in many cases, authors have focused on inventions in expos. I think it's basically making people, helping people make connections in their minds and think about new things. So I hope I answered the question too.
And it's going back to what we were talking about, the underlying layers, right? You have not only the visitors, but the discussions that people have during those events. I was reading your article, the one that I shared, and I was thinking of the Conference of Solvay, right? The 1927 Conference of Solvay, where Einstein, Marie Curie, Niels Bohr, all of them got together. So it's an international act of science, but it's also like where the brilliant minds of the world get together. Right now, it's different. We live in a more global world, but I see similarities to this.
Yes, and those connections still happen, and especially because countries pay for these experts to come together. I mean, they are all sponsored to be there. They're sponsored to take the time to discuss, to meet each other, and personal connections matter a lot. I think we're still far away from replacing personal connections with the online connection.
There was recently an article about the relevance of digital open science for humanities.
Yes.
And it's an interesting debate because you cannot share the same data in the humanities as you can in computer science or in engineering. Yes. Pablo had a question. Pablo, could you?
Yes, hi. Okay, talk. While listening to you, I realized that I'm a closeted expo nerd, international expo nerd, because I visited many sites along my life.
Nice.
I've been to very many of them. Like the first one I remember was Brussels with the atomic and the huge cantilever needle. But then obviously Paris has a few of them. They're still remaining, especially the Eiffel Tower, which we all know. Chicago, the Colombian exhibition, there's nothing there, but it impacted that. And I want to make a footnote about innovation and Expos. And for those of Moya working actually in Washington physically, maybe not, they don't know that Washington became what it is now because the Colombian exhibition in Chicago happened in 1893, because it was so successful and it brought classical architecture and urbanism back into the forefront. So the government decided to make Washington again like it looked in the L'Enfant plan. So the Washington we have now is a consequence of the Colombian exposition of 1893. And with that, I leave you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for that. It's really interesting.
That's a genius. Right. Paula wanted to know if some of the principles that are applied, for example, to the Moroccan pavilion could be applied to the construction of Olympic facilities that are sometimes left behind as white elephants.
I think, well, the starting point would be basically that pavilions are supposed to be dismantled, whereas Olympic buildings are supposed to stay. I think it's a very interesting point of view, because what was happening before with Expos is that, as I mentioned, these buildings were left to become something and they never became anything. And I think the organizers, the regulatory organization, understood that it was better to just make them ephemeral. Now with Olympic buildings, I think it all comes to planning. I mean, if the city really needs that kind of infrastructure, maybe the solution is to create something that adapts, kind of like these multi-function stadiums. You know, you can use it for sports, but then you can use it for cultural events, other kind of experiences. So or maybe going much deeper, and this is a bit imagining having the initial design as a kind of like how to say, the facade, you know, and then the inside can be removed, and then you use that facade for something else. I think it needs a lot of planning, and unfortunately, as I think we have seen examples probably in Beijing and in Athens, that they didn't really need this infrastructure, and in the rush to impress the world, they create these huge buildings. I mean, I think countries need to find a balance, and maybe the International Olympic Committee should have a say here. Because in Expos, it came from the top.
Yeah, it looks like there are some egos from countries that they want to show off, and then they let those countries with huge pieces of infrastructure that are not needed, and they end up decaying and destroying pieces of the city that could have much had better uses.
Exactly. And part of the problem is in Expos and I guess in Olympic Games is that a government administration starts a project, and then a completely different administration deals with it, and maybe sometimes even a third one deals with what happens next. So
yeah, and few generations pay for it.
Exactly. I mean, these buildings are huge and hard to ignore. So yeah, they have a big effect.
Nowadays, cathedrals.
Yeah.
Like medieval cathedrals, they started in 1st century and were finished 3 centuries later with a complete different style.
Exactly. Yeah, but at least they are used.
Cesar?
I mean, they still have an impact on the city, and so that would be the difference. Yes.
Cesar, it's been fantastic. We really appreciate your time. We learned a lot. And I hope that everybody please check the blog for Cesar Writes, because it's really good. The Center for Public Diplomacy, they have great insights. I have more questions, but we want to respect your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you have more questions, send me an email. I'm very happy to answer them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Muchas gracias.
See you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Gracias.